On October 20th, 2020, I had a conversation over Zoom with composer Judith Shatin. Her music includes chamber, choral and orchestral, electronic, electroacoustic, and multimedia, combining an adventurous approach to timbre with dynamic narrative design. Her imagination is sparked by her multiple fascinations with literature and the visual arts, with the sounding world, both natural and built, and with the social and communicative power of music. She has received numerous commissions and awards, and her music has been widely performed and recorded. Shatin is Professor Emerita at the University of Virginia, where she founded the renowned Virginia Center for Computer Music. Zamir was to have performed Hark My Love, Shatin's beautiful setting of verses from the Song of Songs, but the coronavirus forced us to shut down rehearsals. So we will play a recording by a guest choir, the Laudibus Choir, conducted by Michael Brewer. Listen for the excitement in the opening phrases, the musical interpretation of the lover leaping like a young deer, then the legato yearning of the lovers. After the recording, stay tuned for my full-length interview with the composer. We are pleased and honored to have with us today the renowned composer Judith Shatin. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you so much.
Let's start. How did you get started in music? Who or what inspired you?
How I got started in music is something that happened long, long ago when I was a young child. My father was a clinical psychologist who was working with some musicians, and they said to him, "You have daughters, you should have a piano." So he took their advice and he got an old piano, an upright, and I just gravitated towards it. I loved it. And it was in a room that was right next to my bedroom. And so I would get up very early in the morning and run to the piano and mess around, probably making all kinds of terrible sounds on it. But my parents noticed that and asked me if I wanted lessons, which I did. So I feel very fortunate to have started music at a very young age. Although I did not start composing seriously until I was an undergraduate at Douglas College, and had some wonderful theory teachers, and also had the opportunity to study with Robert Maves, who was an extraordinary composer himself, a very demanding and very exciting teacher. And I decided, although I had studied in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, I did my junior year there, fully intending to study music until I got there and realized that even finding a piano that I would have access to was going to be an extraordinary problem. So I followed my other loves at that time, which included studying numerous courses in history and psychology. And then when I returned to Douglas College and continued with my composing, I decided that I really did not want to do a senior piano recital, which of course was the norm, but I wanted to do a composition recital. So I approached the then chair of that department, who was not very enthusiastic about my idea, but eventually I convinced him that if I composed the music, of course, organized it, played one of the pieces myself, that they would let me do it. So they did. And I really loved that experience, and I just never looked back. So it was a long and rather winding path that led me eventually to do my master's at Juilliard, where I encountered Milton Babbitt in a course on Schoenberg. And I became so fascinated by that and by my lessons with him that I moved to Princeton, where I did my PhD, and then joined the faculty at the University of Virginia. And since coming here, which I did in 1979, it became apparent to me that progress along the technological front was happening. And I had always been kind of fascinated by the infinity of possibility that technology offered in the musical domain, but I felt that the technology hadn't yet caught up. But eventually I was able to found the Virginia Center for Computer Music at UVA back in the mid 80s. And so I have bounced back and forth between acoustic music, which I continue to love, and digital media, ditto, and combining the two and moving back and forth and thinking of them as really offering the opportunity to expand the world of what music is and can be, rather than having to make a choice between the two. So that's a long answer to a short question.
A beautiful answer. Judith, you composed a number of pieces with Jewish content, shall we say. What inspired you to do that?
That's an interesting question. What inspired me? Different kinds of things. First of all, although I do not come from a very religious background in my parents' generation, my paternal grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. My father's first language was Yiddish, although to my regret, I did not learn it growing up. So I've always felt a strong connection. I'm very drawn to to a great deal of literature, to biblical verse. I've said a number of Psalms. I have also, through my husband, who is, well, he has a complicated story too, but he's a dual Israeli-American citizen. And he taught me a beautiful melody by his paternal grandfather, which isn't, as far as we can tell, written down anywhere. And I was commissioned by the Pittsburgh Jewish Music Festival with support from the LA Commission on Jewish Music to compose a piece celebrating the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah in particular. And this melody came from that kind of celebration. So I did a piece called Teruah for shofar, brass ensemble, and timpani. So, I'm drawn to many different kinds of things, but music with a Jewish spiritual connection certainly forms an important theme in my music. I also did a piece called Elijah's Chariot, which was commissioned by the Kronos Quartet for amplified string quartet and recordings processed from shofar recordings.
Wow.
And in that one, the melody Eliyahu Hanavi makes quite an appearance at one point after this sort of transmogrification into heaven. The performers hum that melody as well as playing it. And I became so utterly obsessed by it that I shortly thereafter had a residency at Brahms' house in Baden-Baden with this huge picture of Brahms staring down at me all the time. And I composed high variations on Eliyahu Hanavi, a set, of course, of 18 variations, in which I've always thought of performers in every instance, whether they have overt choice about ordering or anything or not, as collaborators. And I decided in that piece to make that more overt, and the order of the variations is up to the performer. So it turns out there are 18 factorial, which comes out to an absolutely astonishingly enormous number of opportunities for the performers. I've also been very drawn to a number of poets that deal with Jewish themes, and my Songs of War and Peace, which is a setting of 4 wonderful poems by Israeli poets in outstanding American translations. One of them is very short. It's called Peace is a Sea, which is also its first line. Peace is a sea whose waves will carry us far. And one of them is by Azriel Kaufman, and it's called And How My Brother is Cain, and it's about the assassination of Rabin. So I'm drawn to these sort of in many different guises, as you can see from the kind of range that I've been describing.
Is your approach to a Jewish text or a Jewish theme different from your approach to other types of compositions? Is there a sound that we could say, that's a Jewish piece?
I don't really know how to answer that. Of course, in the music that has identifiable elements such as shofar or a tune that people would know, it's very overt. But for instance, another piece called Gregor's Dream, which was commissioned by the Jerusalem-based Atar piano trio, that was commissioned for a program called Dream Within a Dream. And being the happy-go-lucky person that I am, the first thing that popped into my mind was Kafka's Metamorphosis, where Gregor is waking up from his dream as a bug. And so I think one can say that also has a Jewish theme. Well, it's Jewish, but it's also thinking about identifying different groups, ourselves and the other. The bug is not part of the family, but the bug is part of the family. And in that piece, I used a tiny snippet, I don't know how many people would even know, of the Kol Nidra melody. So things kind of weave in and out in greater and lesser degrees of identity, maybe. But certainly because of my background, there is a strong element of that. But I'm also drawn to literature and spiritual practices of other cultures. For instance, I have a orchestra piece called Piping the Earth, which was inspired by a lecture I heard on the Chuanzi, an ancient Chinese text. I have a piano concerto called The Passion of Saint Cecilia, inspired by the story of Cecilia, which is a fascinating one, but also by the association, which is quite likely erroneous, of her to music and therefore to other arts, which appears to have been based on, it's not clear whether an intentional or unintentional mistranslation in the 15th century. So I guess I just have a kind of antennae up. But again, coming back to the music that that does relate to Jewish themes, it's important to me. And I can't really put a finger on exactly the stylistic elements that are different. So I'll leave that to some musicologists if they're curious. However, there are certainly overt elements in a number of pieces, and then references which may or may not be perceived readily by the casual listener.
Let's turn our attention now to Hark My Love, which is the piece that we had programmed. And I believe it was commissioned by
Judith Klorman. Actually, no, it wasn't commissioned per se. I'm trying to remember. I think she did ask me to compose it and she did premiere it.
But you chose the text?
I chose the text. I was very drawn to Marvin Pope's beautiful translation of the Song of Songs, and to these verses in particular. This piece is dedicated to my husband, Michael Kabovi, and he is also has been wonderfully engaged in especially my Hebrew settings, as he's a native Hebrew speaker. I just was drawn to the beauty of this text and to the kind of, people talk about the metaphorical meanings, but there's also the Hark My Love is also certainly about love.
Sure.
And so I wanted to find a way to set it that has the kind of springy joy that the text suggested to me. One of the things I love about text setting, and I do all kinds, is finding ways that music can kind of partner with the words, that it can amplify something about the words and their meaning.
Well, it is a joyous piece, and there is a lot of text painting going
Yes.
on in that, the leaping and the jumping and the joy. I love the piece.
Thank you so much.
Let's go back now to, again, the subject of our investigation of women in Jewish music. Your career, did you ever encounter any challenges as a woman? Were there obstacles that you had to overcome because of your gender? Was it difficult to be taken seriously as a composer?
I'm laughing because, yes, it was all along the way. I think to some degree still is. Of course, it's better now than it was. But for instance, a number of years ago now already, I was asked to do a keynote by the College Music Society on the teaching of composition in America during the previous 50 years. And I thought that's a really fascinating topic. And one of the things they wanted me to include, and I wanted to include, was what about gender? What about diversity? So I decided, okay, to kind of define the problem, I just chose doctoral degree granting institutions, and I think there were about 25 of them. So I started by contacting them and asking for any statistics they had. Well, nobody had kept any records, so there weren't any. So I found the College Music Society directory of faculty, and I just painstakingly went through it. And I looked at all these different programs. And with maybe one or two exceptions. There was maybe one woman and several men. Many there were none. I think Stony Brook and the University of Chicago were two exceptions. But for women to find positions in academia when I was coming up was extraordinarily difficult. That has happily changed some. To exactly what extent, I don't know. Finding diversity statistics was even more of a problem. And I was also curious about graduate students to the pipeline into academia. And again, no records that people were keeping then. They are now. So I think that maybe 50 years from now, it will be easier to tell, or 25 years from now. So just to share a few kinds of things, let's see. Someone who will remain nameless, when I was looking for a job in academia, suggested I should try for a junior women's college as an appropriate venue. I can remember serving on committees where music that looked like it was in a female hand was just passed over. When I was a fellow at the Tanglewood Music Festival, and one of my first days there, someone asked me what I did, and I said I was a composer, and the answer was, "Ooh, a lady composer, like what is that thing?" There have been many, many instances along the way. However, there have also been some wonderful counterbalances to that. I feel like a number of the people that I worked with along the way were very supportive, and I'm a person of determination, so I always just kept plowing ahead. But I was president of American Women Composers from 1989 to 93. I felt that it was really important that there be that at that point, Tommy Chorale had been president and she was retiring, and it was an important organization at the time. And I met all kinds of amazing women through it. And at that period, people still just did not realize how many women composers there were. Many still don't know how many there are. And then a number of years later, at one of the conferences that happened to be in Alaska, in Anchorage, a number of us, there were then several organizations for women in music, got together and said, why do we have three separate organizations? There should be one. So there's now one wonderful one on the board of advisors of the International Alliance for Women in Music. And any of your listeners who don't already belong, I strongly encourage you to join. It's a terrific organization. It has a wonderful journal, very active listserv, has done a lot of work to help women in music in all kinds of different ways, not just composers, but performers, musicologists, and any interested parties, and just sharing work. They've done annual concerts. We used to have a series at the National Museum for Women in the Arts in DC. That's now become something that's moved around to different venues annually. So there's been a lot of effort to help connect people and to raise awareness of the work that's been done by women over the years. And there is so much. There is truly so much.
So a few minutes ago, you talked about if a score was submitted with a woman's handwriting or something that looked like a woman's handwriting. So here's a loaded question. Do you think that there is a woman's voice? Is there something about a composition that you would say a woman wrote that? And I understand there's this, I don't know, should we say a dialectic between wanting to be a total equality, gender equality, and yet wanting to have a unique voice.
So here's what I think about that one, and I've thought about it a lot. No, you can't tell. Morton Feldman does beautiful, incredibly quiet music. If you didn't know, you might, make a link between the traditional idea of quiet, etc., being female. I will tell you a funny story that happened to me. My piano concerto, Passion of Saint Cecilia, the second movement is very tender. The first and third, the first one is called combative. The third one is angry. And it's violent. It is radically violent. So I met a conductor who had heard the piece, and he looked at me and he said, "That music, you?" And so there was this a bit of a shock that if you don't present a certain way, and then people hear music that has a great emotional range, violence, there's an assumption made about gender, which reminds me of an experience I had. I went to a lecture by Hina Stara once, and I had never seen a picture of him. And his music is wild and wonderful. And he looked like a banker. And I had a bit of that same kind of experience. So, but I don't think that one can essentialize. There may be music that that has been constrained in some ways to certain kinds of patterning that maybe you could build an argument. But I think we have individual voices, and what I am in favor of, at least for myself, is being able to have a very wide range of emotion in my music. I don't want it to be curtailed, and I do want it to be experienced by others as I experience it by myself. I guess I'm thinking that music can have a sympathetic resonance in others in terms of experience.
It's like reading fiction. One of the reasons it's so wonderful is we can enter somebody else's head by doing that, and it's a very expanding experience. Did you ever sing in a choir?
I did.
Yeah, tell us
I
about
loved
it.
it. So my first choral experience was in junior high school when I lived in South Orange, New Jersey. And we had a special choir, and it met before school at 7:15 in the morning.
Ooh, you were dedicated.
And we all just loved it. It was a wonderful experience. I also sang in chorus in college. I really enjoyed all of those experiences very much. And I've loved choral music. There's just something about the combination of the vividness of melodic interaction with text. I love singing it, and I love creating it.
Well put. What have you been doing since the pandemic struck us? How has that affected your work?
Well, I'm very fortunate that I have a home studio, and I have projects that that I find very meaningful to do. In addition to a piece for the Kastia Ensemble inspired by the 9th century abbess hymnographer and poet, who, by the way, has an extraordinary poem called Stupidity that that people might enjoy reading in relation to what's going on in our current situation. She was an extraordinary person, and although the spiritual tradition is, of course, radically different from mine, I have found it really fascinating, and I'm very grateful to the musicologists who have studied that period and made her music available to us. And she's actually, as far as I can tell, the earliest woman whose music is still extant today. And a couple of her hymns are in the current Greek Orthodox liturgy. I'm about to start setting some poetry that I find very moving, that is from children who are incarcerated at our southern border, which is a situation that has been, that I just find incredibly distressing. And it's from a volume called Dreaming America. And the poetry has been translated by a wonderful poet named Seth Mickelson himself. And it's called Voices of Undocumented Youth in Maximum Security Detention. And I'm planning to set it in the original Spanish because I want their words to be heard as they meant them in the original. So but I also, I guess I have a playful streak because I'm also have been working on a series called Quotidian Music. And the first of that series was an electronic piece that I made by going into a studio and taking a bunch of different types of tape, like Scotch tape, electric tape, duct tape, all kinds of different tape, and messing around and ripping it and recording it. And I did a surround sound piece called Tape Music. And then I did another version for any number of people who each have a small box, a blunt object like a chopstick, and tape on a dispenser with teeth. And I premiered that with some kids from the Sabo Point School in Richmond and had such a great time with it. It was just really so much fun. So we had a set of actions, and I had placards that had the different actions, and I will hold them up and they do the actions. And then I had electronic tape that they were performing with. So the next one after that was a piece called Zipper Music for two zipper players and interactive electronics. And I'm just doing a version of that at the request of a former student of mine for Zipper Player Quartet and interactive electronics. And so in addition to loving to work with and collaborate with performers of traditional instruments, it really kind of opened me up to the sounds of the world around us and how they can be put into a musical context that really explores and expands on the sound of origin, so that some of the sounds in the zipper piece, for instance, it's very obvious you can hear the zipper sound amplified, but there are other transformations where you would never know what the origin was. But to me, it really depends. So another piece that I did, I was driving in my car and I heard a voice on the radio on NPR saying, "Live your life as though you're already dead." And I thought, well, that's quite a line. And then I realized it was the poet Charles Wright, who so happens to be a friend of mine. So I called up Charles and I said, "Hey, Charles, that was so great. Can I get you in the studio to record some of your poetry? I'd love to do a piece." And he's a very private person, but he agreed. And I recorded 4 of his really wonderful poems from his last volume called Caribou. And they're all about taking leave of life in different ways. And so I did a piece for amplified piano and electronics from his readings. And I just found it so moving to be working with his voice, reading these wonderful poems. So I think, just leaving oneself open to experience whenever it happens can lead one in many different directions. Sometimes I chastise myself for roaming maybe a little too widely, but it's given me so much pleasure that I don't take myself too seriously when I get into that mood.
You certainly do go in many different directions, but I sense that there is depth as well as breadth to your work.
Well, I think I'm not a fast worker. I wish I were sometimes, but I think that taking the time, for instance, when I'm working with electronics, and although I have on occasion worked with directly synthesizing sound using computer technologies, typically I enjoy using source material from the world around us of one sort and another. And the first thing I do is spend hour upon hour exploring the timbral world to see what I can manage with it. And with text setting, one of the things that I did not mention is how very difficult I find it to find texts that I want to set. And circling back to Jewish music, one of the text settings that I found most moving was one that I did fairly recently. I set 3 poems by Abraham Sutzkever in the original Yiddish for bass singer, clarinet, cello, and piano. I've also done a version now with baritone. And I was inspired by the Mussorgsky Songs and Dances of Death, which are dark but really fantastic. And I just found these poems incredibly meaningful. And they're Holocaust poems, and they are dark, but shot through with such extraordinary imagery. And I dedicated that one to my father and my paternal grandparents, whose first language, as I mentioned, was Yiddish.
Well, that brings it around very nicely to where we began. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Judith?
No, I just want to thank you for your work to bring this music to light, and for all the other amazing conducting that you do. And to say again that to me, one of the real joys is collaborating, the give and take with performers, and the sort of manifesting in the world. I am not someone who is content to imagine in my head. I love the actual experience of bringing things to life, and the final aspect of that is to share them with others, with the performers and listeners.
Well, let's hope that soon we'll be able to get back to being in the community of musicians and audience. Thank you again so much for your time, and I wish you all the best and good health.
Same to you. Thank you so very much.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.